People think machines are just metal and code, but sometimes they're the only things in the galaxy that tell the truth. The wind howled across the glassed battlefield, carrying the faint metallic scent of overheated circuits and cooling alloy as Daniel Carter adjusted the collar of his worn utility jacket and stepped carefully through the salvage field. The battle had ended hours ago, but the aftermath stretched for miles across the desert plain like the skeleton of some enormous mechanical beast. Cracked hull plating glinted under the pale light of the twin moons, and broken drones lay half-buried in sand that had fused into glass under the heat of energy discharges. For Daniel, though, this place wasn't a graveyard. It was a workshop. At 32 years old, Daniel Carter had spent most of his life fixing things that other people had already given up on. Back on Earth, he had repaired tractors and air conditioning units in rural Kansas. But out here on the edge of human space, he worked as a battlefield mechanic for a mixed coalition fleet. His job was simple in theory: recover what could still be used, patch what could still be saved, and move on before the next conflict made the same mess all over again. Most mechanics worked in teams. Daniel preferred working alone. Machines, unlike people, didn't lie about what was broken. A cracked panel meant stress. A burnt circuit meant overload. Every failure told a story if you were patient enough to listen. His boots crunched over crystallized sand as his portable scanner beeped softly on his wrist, picking up faint energy signatures buried beneath the wreckage. Usually it was nothing special: damaged servos, drained batteries, fragments of targeting systems. But tonight the scanner flickered with something different. A deeper power source. Older. More complex. Daniel slowed his pace, eyes narrowing as he followed the signal toward a half-collapsed ridge of alloy debris. The desert wind shifted, pushing dust away from a shape partially buried beneath the sand. At first glance it looked like another piece of armored plating, but when Daniel brushed the sand aside with the toe of his boot, he froze. It wasn't just armor. It was a full combat suit, sleek, layered in iridescent turquoise alloy that caught the moonlight like the surface of a calm ocean. Even damaged, the design carried a quiet authority. The lines were elegant, almost ceremonial. Nothing like the rugged human gear he was used to repairing. Daniel knelt beside it slowly, running a gloved hand across the cracked chest plate. The surface felt warm, not from heat, but from residual energy humming deep within its core. Alien engineering. Advanced alien engineering. And not the kind usually left lying around in a battlefield salvage zone. He leaned closer, studying the fractures in the armor's joints. Whoever had worn this suit had relied on it heavily. The external damage wasn't the interesting part, though. The interesting part was the pattern beneath it. Daniel tilted his head slightly, following a thin seam of burnt circuitry along the side of the torso unit. That wasn't impact damage. That was a systems cascade. Something inside the armor had failed long before the outer shell cracked. He exhaled slowly, a faint smile forming at the corner of his mouth. Well, he murmured to the empty desert. That's not supposed to happen. He brushed more sand away, revealing the intricate mechanisms beneath the plating. Even with half the system offline, the engineering was beautiful, precise, disciplined, almost artistic. But Daniel's smile faded as he noticed something else. A design flaw. Small, subtle, but fatal to the system's balance. He sat back on his heels, staring at the armor in silence while the desert wind whispered through the wreckage around him. Whoever built this suit had been brilliant. But whoever designed that internal relay had made a mistake. And Daniel Carter had never been very good at walking away from broken machines that deserved another chance. Daniel Carter stared at the exposed circuitry for a long moment, while the desert wind slid through the wreckage around him like a slow breath across broken metal. The armor was quiet now, but he could still feel the faint hum of dormant power beneath the cracked shell, like a heartbeat waiting for permission to continue. Most mechanics would have logged the find and called a recovery team. Protocol said alien technology that advanced should never be touched by unauthorized personnel. Daniel understood the rule. He just did not agree with it. Machines were not sacred objects. They were problems waiting for solutions. He leaned closer and carefully lifted a fractured panel along the torso seam. The internal systems revealed themselves layer by layer, a maze of crystalline circuits and articulated micro-servos arranged with almost artistic precision. The alien engineers who built this suit had clearly believed in symmetry and perfection. Every component fit exactly where it was supposed to. Every connection followed strict structural logic. And that was exactly the problem. Daniel traced a burnt relay line with the tip of a small diagnostic probe. The cascade failure had started here. One overloaded node had sent a chain reaction through the suit's control architecture, shutting down the stabilization field that supported the entire frame. The designers had assumed that system would never fail. Human engineers never made that assumption. Daniel sat back on the sand and pulled a compact toolkit from his backpack. The metal clasps clicked open softly in the cold night air. Inside were tools that had repaired cargo haulers, atmospheric processors, and once an entire shuttle engine that a pilot had sworn was completely destroyed. Daniel picked up a thin magnetic driver and rolled it slowly between his fingers. "You are beautiful," he said quietly to the armor, studying the alien craftsmanship again. "But you are stubborn." He powered on his wrist scanner and connected it to the damaged relay node. The small display flickered as streams of alien code scrolled across the screen. The translation algorithms struggled for several seconds before stabilizing into readable engineering data. Daniel's eyes narrowed as he studied the system structure. The armor had been designed around absolute control. Every motion command passed through a single master relay network before distributing power to the suit's limbs and stabilization units. Elegant, efficient, and dangerously fragile. One relay failure had shut down the entire architecture. On Earth, mechanics built redundancy into everything because humans knew machines failed. That difference sat right in front of him like a quiet challenge. Daniel reached into the wreckage around him and pulled a small fragment of salvaged alloy from a damaged drone chassis. It was not alien technology. It was something simpler, something human engineers used all the time when they needed a quick solution in difficult conditions. Improvisation. He opened the armor's access panel completely and exposed the central relay hub. Even damaged, the internal components shimmered faintly with residual energy. For a moment, Daniel hesitated. This was not his equipment. It was probably not even human property. But the flaw in the system bothered him more than the rules did. A machine that advanced deserved to work the way it was meant to. Daniel exhaled slowly and reached for his micro solder tool. The blue tip glowed softly as it warmed. "All right," he said quietly, leaning over the armor. "Let us see if we can teach you how humans solve problems." Far above him, the twin moons drifted through thin clouds, while Daniel Carter began carefully rebuilding a system that the alien engineers had already decided was impossible to repair. The small soldering tool hummed softly in Daniel Carter's hand as the thin blue arc of heat sealed the final connection inside the alien relay hub. The work had taken longer than he expected. Alien engineering was elegant but unforgiving, and every adjustment required patience measured in millimeters rather than inches. Daniel leaned back slightly, stretching the stiffness out of his shoulders while the cold desert wind brushed across the battlefield wreckage around him. The twin moons had moved higher into the sky, washing the glassed sand in pale silver light. For several seconds, he simply watched the armor, listening to the quiet ticking sound of cooling alloy. Machines always spoke in small sounds if you paid attention. A faint shift in pressure, a subtle vibration through metal, a whisper of current moving where it had not moved before. Daniel reached forward and connected his scanner again. The display flickered as the armor's internal systems attempted their first reboot. Lines of unfamiliar alien code scrolled across the screen like flowing water. Daniel followed the system diagnostics carefully, watching the relay network come back online one section at a time. Power stabilization field, inactive. Motion control network, inactive. Environmental regulation, standby. The new bypass he had installed sat quietly inside the architecture like an unofficial bridge, linking circuits that the original designers had never intended to connect. It was not elegant. It was not symmetrical. But it was human. Daniel folded his arms and watched the scanner. "Come on," he murmured softly. The armor remained silent for another moment. Then the chest plate beneath his hand vibrated gently. The scanner display flashed green. Power stabilization field, active. Daniel blinked once in surprise. The system had accepted the new relay path faster than he expected. A soft tone sounded from somewhere deep inside the suit as dormant systems woke one by one. Thin lines of turquoise light traced themselves across the armor's surface like veins filling with energy. Daniel lowered the scanner. Slowly, studying the glow with quiet satisfaction. "Well," he said, tilting his head slightly, "that is a good sign." The armor continued its startup sequence, drawing small amounts of power from the still functional core buried within the torso unit. Diagnostic lights flickered along the shoulder joints. Internal gyroscopic stabilizers recalibrated. The once silent suit now carried the faint mechanical rhythm of a machine, remembering how to move. Daniel brushed a thin layer of sand from the helmet crest and examined the suit again with new curiosity. Up close, the design details became even more impressive. The layered alloy plating was lighter than it looked, engineered to flex with the wearer's movement while still maintaining structural integrity. Whoever built this armor had not just been designing protection. They had been designing an extension of the body itself. He wondered briefly who the suit had belonged to. The craftsmanship suggested someone important. Not a standard soldier. Something higher. A commander, perhaps. Or someone whose presence on a battlefield meant more than strategy. Daniel rested one hand lightly against the chest plate again. The armor responded with a gentle shift as the stabilization field adjusted its balance automatically. It was subtle, but the suit was clearly trying to compensate for the damage it had suffered earlier. "You are learning," Daniel said quietly. The scanner chimed again as another system came online. Motion control network, partially restored. Daniel let out a slow breath, impressed despite himself. Even damaged, the alien technology was far more advanced than anything he usually worked with. And yet the solution had still been simple. Not perfect engineering, just practical thinking. He packed away the soldering tool and sat back on the sand, studying the glowing suit beneath the moonlight. Somewhere in the distance, a transport drone passed high overhead, its engines humming faintly across the night sky. Daniel barely noticed. His attention remained fixed on the armor as the final system indicator appeared on his scanner. Primary control interface, awaiting operator. Daniel frowned slightly. That was unexpected. The suit was not simply repairing itself. It was ready. Ready for someone to wear it again. He glanced across the empty battlefield, then back at the quietly glowing armor. "Well," he said softly, almost amused by the situation, "I hope whoever owns you appreciates human repair work." Daniel Carter stared at the softly glowing armor for several quiet seconds while the desert wind continued to slide across the broken battlefield around him. The stabilization field hummed with steady confidence now, a low mechanical heartbeat pulsing through the turquoise alloy. It was not the sound of a damaged machine anymore. It was the sound of a system that believed it was ready to work again. Daniel tilted his head slightly, studying the helmet crest where a faint line of energy now traced along the engraved surface. The suit had clearly belonged to someone important, not just because of the materials or the craftsmanship, but because of the balance of its design. Whoever wore this armor had expected to move quickly, to think quickly, and to trust that the machine would respond without hesitation. That kind of equipment was never given to ordinary soldiers. Daniel reached for his scanner again and checked the diagnostic feed. Every major system was still stable. The bypass relay he had installed continued to distribute power across the control network without triggering any instability warnings. The architecture looked strange now, a mixture of alien precision and human improvisation working together in quiet cooperation. "You are not perfect anymore," Daniel said softly as he brushed another layer of sand away from the shoulder plate. "But you are stronger than before." The armor responded with a subtle mechanical shift as internal calibration motors adjusted the balance of the frame. The movement was small, almost like a sleeping animal stretching after a long rest. Daniel raised one eyebrow in quiet surprise. He had expected the system to reboot. He had not expected it to adapt this quickly. The scanner chimed again with a new line of data scrolling across the display. Neural interface network. Active and awaiting operator authentication. Daniel frowned slightly. That line had not appeared during the earlier diagnostic cycles. He studied the readout carefully, reading the alien symbols through the translation software. The suit was not simply online. It was waiting for its owner. "Well, that explains the craftsmanship," he murmured quietly. The wind shifted again, carrying a faint echo of distant engines somewhere far across the desert. Daniel glanced up briefly toward the horizon, but saw nothing except endless dark sand and shattered metal reflecting moonlight. Salvage teams sometimes worked late after battles, but this region had been declared clear hours ago. No one else should have been out here tonight. He returned his attention to the armor. The glowing lines along the chest plate brightened slightly as the system adjusted its internal energy flow. Daniel slowly reached forward and tapped the alloy surface with one knuckle. The metal felt warm and alive beneath the touch, responding instantly to the contact, as if the machine recognized that someone had helped bring it back to life. For a moment, he considered shutting the suit down again. Protocol would say that was the safest option, but something about the quiet confidence of the system made him hesitate. Machines did not ask permission. They simply waited for the next command. Daniel leaned back on one hand and studied the armor again while the desert wind carried another distant sound across the empty battlefield. This time the noise was clearer. Engines, not salvage drones. Larger, controlled. Daniel slowly stood and looked toward the horizon. A faint formation of lights had appeared far in the distance, gliding low across the dark desert like silent stars moving along the ground. Transport craft. Several of them. And they were heading directly toward this section of the battlefield. Daniel glanced down at the glowing armor beside him and then back toward the approaching lights. "I have a feeling," he said quietly to the silent suit, "that someone very important is coming back to look for you." Daniel Carter stood quietly beside the glowing armor while the distant lights grew brighter across the desert horizon. The transport craft moved with smooth precision, their engines producing a deep, steady hum that rolled across the glassed sand like distant thunder. These were not salvage drones or civilian recovery ships. The formation was too organized, too controlled. Military transports, and not human ones. Daniel narrowed his eyes as the shapes of the approaching vessels became clearer against the night sky. Each craft carried the same faint turquoise glow along its hull lines that the armor beside him now emitted. The design was unmistakably alien, sleek and balanced in a way human ships rarely were. Whoever was arriving here had come for something important. Daniel slowly crouched beside the armor again, studying the illuminated circuits with a thoughtful expression. "Well," he murmured under his breath, "this is going to be awkward." The armor responded with another quiet mechanical adjustment, as if aware of the approaching presence. The stabilization field hummed slightly louder for a moment before settling into a steady rhythm again. Daniel glanced at his scanner. The system remained perfectly stable. If anything, the suit seemed more confident with every passing second, like a machine that had finally been given permission to breathe again. The transport craft were close enough now that their lights cast long moving shadows across the broken battlefield. Several ships slowed and hovered about 200 feet above the sand, while one larger vessel descended toward the surface with careful control. Daniel watched it lower itself slowly, the landing thrusters pushing waves of dust outward in smooth spirals. The craft settled gently onto the desert floor less than 100 yards away. The engines powered down with a low mechanical sigh. For a moment, the desert returned to silence. Daniel remained where he was, one hand resting lightly on the repaired armor as he waited. A ramp unfolded along the side of the transport ship with quiet mechanical grace. Soft interior lighting spilled out across the sand as several tall figures stepped down onto the battlefield. Even from this distance, their posture carried unmistakable authority. Their armor matched the design of the suit beside Daniel, though theirs was darker and clearly functional rather than ceremonial. They moved with calm precision, scanning the wreckage around them before their attention gradually shifted toward the faint turquoise glow coming from Daniel's position. One of the figures paused and spoke quietly to the others in a language Daniel's translator could not quite process from this distance. The tone carried a mixture of confusion and urgency. It was the reaction of people who had come expecting to recover something damaged, not something that was quietly humming with restored power. The group began walking toward him across the glass sand. Their pace was steady but careful, each step deliberate. Daniel raised both hands slightly away from his tools in a gesture of harmless transparency. He had no intention of surprising anyone tonight. As the alien soldiers approached within 30 feet, the lead figure suddenly slowed. The glowing armor beside Daniel reflected across the polished surface of the soldier's helmet. The suit was clearly recognizable to them. One of the soldiers spoke again, this time in a sharper tone. Daniel's translator struggled for a second before producing a rough interpretation in his earpiece. "That is impossible." The lead soldier stepped closer, studying the armor with intense focus. the turquoise lines along. The repaired circuits pulsed softly in response to the suit's internal systems. The soldier turned slightly, looking from the armor to Daniel and then back again. Daniel offered a small shrug. It was broken, he said calmly. Now it is not. The alien soldiers stared at him in silence for several seconds. Then one of them activated a communicator attached to the side of their helmet and spoke a short message. The words were too distorted for Daniel's translator to understand clearly, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a report, and whoever they were reporting to was important enough to make every soldier on that battlefield suddenly stand a little straighter while they waited for a response. The alien soldiers remained motionless after the message was sent, their attention fixed on the glowing armor beside Daniel Carter, as if they were watching something sacred slowly breathe again. The desert wind moved quietly through the wreckage around them, brushing across shattered metal and glass sand, while the turquoise light from the suit reflected softly across their dark helmets. Daniel shifted his weight slightly, but kept his hands visible. He had learned long ago that calm movements were the universal language of mechanics and soldiers alike. Machines respected patience, and most armed professionals did too. One of the alien soldiers stepped forward and slowly crouched beside the armor, studying the exposed access panel where Daniel's tools still rested. The soldier extended a gloved hand toward the circuitry but stopped just short of touching it, as if uncertain whether the system would react. The glowing relay network pulsed gently, distributing power through the new pathway Daniel had built into the architecture. The soldier's helmet tilted slightly, while the internal display of their visor analyzed the unfamiliar configuration. Daniel watched the reaction carefully. Even without understanding the alien language, the body language was clear. Surprise, confusion, and something else that Daniel recognized from years of repair work. Respect for a clever solution. Another soldier spoke quietly behind the first one, the voice calm but firm. Daniel's translator struggled again before delivering a rough interpretation through the small speaker in his earpiece. The relay architecture is altered. The first soldier nodded slowly. Yes. A pause followed while the aliens studied the modified circuitry again. But the system is stable. Daniel could not help smiling slightly at that. Stable was a mechanic's favorite word. The first soldier finally turned toward him, the smooth black visor reflecting the turquoise glow from the armor. Human, the translator rendered, though the alien word carried a tone that sounded more like a classification than an insult. You changed the command network. Daniel shrugged lightly. It was collapsing the whole system. I gave the power somewhere else to go. The soldiers exchanged a brief look. One of them spoke another short sentence into the communicator mounted along the side of their helmet. This time the response came almost immediately, a sharp burst of audio that Daniel's translator could barely process. Whatever the message contained, it caused every soldier present to straighten their posture instantly. Even the one kneeling beside the armor rose to their feet with sudden precision. The group turned toward the landed transport craft as the ramp lighting brightened again. A new figure appeared at the top of the ramp, silhouetted against the interior lights of the ship. Even from nearly 100 yards away, Daniel could sense the shift in the atmosphere around him. The soldiers moved aside automatically, creating a clear path across the battlefield. Authority had arrived. The figure descended the ramp slowly, each step measured and confident. The armor worn by the newcomer was unlike the others. It carried the same turquoise alloy design as the repaired suit beside Daniel. But this set was intact and flawless, reflecting the moonlight like polished crystal. Daniel watched the approach carefully while the faint hum of the repaired armor beside him continued to pulse through the quiet desert air. As the figure walked closer, the turquoise glow from the restored suit brightened slightly, responding to the presence of something familiar. The soldiers noticed it immediately. Several of them turned their heads toward the armor with renewed attention. The approaching figure stopped about 20 feet away from Daniel and the glowing suit. For a moment the battlefield was silent again except for the steady hum of the armor's stabilization field. Then the newcomer spoke a single calm sentence in the alien language. Daniel's translator processed the words slowly before delivering the meaning into his ear. Who repaired my armor? The desert wind fell strangely quiet after the question was spoken, as if even the night itself had paused to listen. Daniel Carter stood beside the softly glowing armor while the turquoise light reflected across the polished surface of the approaching figure's suit. Up close, the alien's presence carried a quiet gravity that did not need raised voices or dramatic movement to be understood. Authority simply existed around them, steady and undeniable. The soldiers nearby lowered their heads slightly in a gesture that looked very much like respect. Daniel glanced from the alien soldiers to the repaired armor and then back to the figure standing before him. The translator in his ear finished processing the sentence again, repeating the meaning with calm precision. Who repaired my armor? Daniel took a slow breath and lifted one hand, pointing gently toward himself with the same casual motion he might use when explaining a repair job back on Earth. That would be me, he said calmly. The words sounded small in the open desert air. For a moment the alien figure did not move. The turquoise armor they wore caught the moonlight like flowing water, every surface polished and flawless. Daniel noticed the details immediately. The design matched the repaired suit almost perfectly, but the one on the alien's body was clearly a more advanced version. This was not just another soldier standing in front of him. The soldiers behind the figure exchanged brief looks. One of them spoke quietly, their voice carrying a hint of concern. Daniel's translator struggled with the alien language before finally delivering a partial interpretation. The human claims responsibility. The figure in front of Daniel slowly turned their head toward the soldier who had spoken. The movement was calm but decisive. The soldier immediately fell silent. Authority did not need to raise its voice. Then the alien turned back toward Daniel. For several long seconds the figure simply studied him. Daniel had spent enough years working around pilots and officers to recognize when someone was evaluating a situation carefully. The alien's gaze shifted briefly from Daniel to the glowing armor resting beside him on the sand. The repaired suit responded instantly to the presence of its apparent owner. The turquoise lines across its surface brightened slightly, and the stabilization field adjusted with a quiet mechanical hum. The alien took one slow step closer. The soldiers behind them remained perfectly still. Daniel resisted the urge to reach for his scanner again. The moment felt less like a technical inspection and more like a conversation between two very different kinds of professionals. The alien stopped beside the repaired armor and studied the open access panel where Daniel's improvised relay bridge was clearly visible inside the circuitry. The figure leaned slightly forward, examining the human components Daniel had integrated into the alien architecture. A soft sound escaped from the alien's helmet speaker. It might have been surprise or curiosity. Finally, the alien spoke again, this time with a slower tone that allowed the translator to keep pace. You altered the command relay network. Daniel nodded once. Yes. Another brief pause followed. The alien's helmet tilted slightly, while the glowing circuits continued to pulse through the armor beside them. Why? Daniel considered the question for a moment before answering. His response came with the same straightforward tone he used whenever someone asked why a machine had been repaired a certain way. Because it was built to fail eventually, he said. And I do not like leaving good machines broken. The alien remained motionless after hearing the answer. The turquoise glow of the restored armor reflected across their helmet visor. For several seconds no one spoke. Then the alien's helmet slowly lifted, focusing directly on Daniel Carter, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. The alien figure continued to study Daniel Carter in silence while the restored armor hummed softly beside them, its turquoise light moving across the sand like calm water under moonlight. For a long moment, the only sound on the battlefield was the quiet rhythm of the stabilization field working perfectly within the machine Daniel had repaired. The soldiers remained absolutely still behind their leader, their attention shifting carefully between the human mechanic and the suit that should have been nothing more than damaged equipment hours earlier. The alien's helmet turned slightly again, looking down at the exposed relay bridge Daniel had installed within the armor's internal network. The human components stood out clearly among the alien architecture. They were not elegant. They were not symmetrical. But they were functioning flawlessly. The alien slowly reached forward and closed the open access panel with careful precision. The suit responded immediately, the turquoise glow settling into a smooth and confident pulse. Daniel folded his arms loosely while watching the motion. It will hold, he said calmly. The translator carried the sentence across the quiet desert. The alien paused after hearing the words, then asked another question with deliberate clarity. You believe you improved it? Daniel tilted his head slightly. I believe it will not fail the same way again. The alien soldiers behind their leader exchanged another brief look. That answer carried a quiet confidence that did not sound like arrogance. It sounded like the calm certainty of someone who understood exactly what he had built. The alien turned slowly toward the repaired armor resting on the sand and extended one gloved hand toward the helmet. The suit reacted instantly to the familiar presence. The stabilization field adjusted, and a soft activation tone sounded from within the armor's internal systems. Even without touching it, the machine clearly recognized the person standing beside it. Daniel noticed the change immediately and raised one eyebrow in quiet interest. That answers one question, he murmured softly. The alien paused briefly, then disengaged the helmet seal of their own armor. The smooth turquoise visor lifted back with a faint mechanical sound, revealing the face beneath it for the first time. The soldiers behind them lowered their heads even further. The figure standing before Daniel Carter was unmistakably the same one whose armor now rested beside him. The same turquoise alloy design. The same precise engineering lines built for command rather than ordinary combat. Daniel blinked once, absorbing the realization. The alien's skin carried a faint iridescent hue that matched the glow of the armor itself, and their eyes reflected the moonlight with sharp clarity. This was not merely a soldier or officer. The presence alone made that obvious. The alien studied Daniel again, this time without the barrier of the helmet visor between them. "You are human," the translator rendered from the calm alien voice. Daniel nodded once. "Last time I checked." The alien's gaze shifted briefly toward the repaired suit before returning to him. "That armor is the command armor of my line," the alien said. "It has been worn by the rulers of my people for generations." Daniel let out a slow breath and glanced down at the suit glowing quietly beside him. "Well," he said after a moment, "that explains why it was built so well." The alien remained silent for several seconds. The wind moved gently across the desert again, stirring small waves of sand around the battlefield wreckage. Then the alien spoke once more, the voice steady but carrying a hint of something Daniel had not heard before. "Curiosity. Human Daniel Carter," the translator said carefully. "Why would you repair the armor of someone you have never met?" Daniel looked down at the glowing suit again before answering. His voice carried the same simple tone he had used since the beginning of the night. "Because," he said, "it deserved to keep working." The desert wind moved softly through the wreckage again, carrying fine grains of glassed sand across the glowing armor, while Daniel Carter stood quietly in front of the alien ruler, whose presence seemed to steady the entire battlefield. The turquoise light from the restored suit pulsed gently between them, like a quiet heartbeat that belonged to both worlds at once. For several seconds the alien leader did not respond to Daniel's explanation. Instead, their eyes moved slowly across the armor resting on the sand, studying the faint energy patterns flowing through the modified relay network hidden beneath the alloy plates. The machine had been part of their people's history for generations, and now a human mechanic had changed it in a way no one else had considered. One of the soldiers shifted slightly behind their leader, clearly uncomfortable with the silence. Daniel noticed it immediately. Soldiers everywhere shared the same habits when they were unsure how their commander would react. The alien ruler finally stepped closer to the armor and placed one hand lightly on the helmet crest. The machine responded instantly, its internal systems adjusting with a smooth mechanical tone as the stabilization field strengthened in recognition of its rightful operator. The glow brightened slightly, spreading across the suit's surface in calm waves of turquoise light. Daniel watched the interaction carefully. Machines often told the truth faster than people did. The armor accepted its owner without hesitation, and it accepted the human repair as well. The alien leader slowly lifted the helmet of the restored suit and examined the inner circuitry, where Daniel's relay bridge connected the alien architecture to human components. For a long moment, they said nothing. Then they looked back at Daniel with an expression that was no longer simply curiosity. It was calculation. "You changed the logic of the system," the translator rendered clearly. Daniel nodded. "I changed how the power moves through it. The original network assumed the central relay would never fail." The alien studied him carefully. "And you did not make that assumption." Daniel shook his head slightly. "On Earth we assume everything fails eventually. That is why we build another path." The soldiers behind their leader exchanged another brief glance. The concept clearly carried weight in their culture. The alien ruler looked back down at the armor and slowly reattached the helmet to the suit. The stabilization field shifted again, adjusting smoothly around the repaired network. When the system completed its recalibration, a soft confirmation tone sounded through the quiet desert air. Daniel smiled faintly. That sound means the system agrees with the repair. The alien ruler turned their attention back to him, studying his face as if trying to understand the strange logic that had led a human mechanic to modify one of the most important artifacts of their people. The wind lifted slightly again, brushing across the battlefield as the alien leader spoke with calm precision. "Human Daniel Carter," the translator said. "The armor of my line has been repaired by the finest engineers in our empire for generations." The alien paused for a moment while the turquoise light reflected across the surface of the restored suit. "None of them changed the system the way you did." Daniel shrugged lightly. "Sometimes the simplest fix is the one nobody wants to try." The alien ruler remained still for several seconds after hearing that. Then they did something none of the soldiers expected. They stepped back from the armor and looked directly at Daniel Carter with a new kind of attention that felt far heavier than the quiet desert air. "Then show me," the alien said slowly, "how a human would improve it further." The request settled over the battlefield with surprising weight, as if the night itself had paused to hear what the human mechanic would say next. Daniel Carter stood quietly for a moment, the turquoise light from the restored armor reflecting across his face, while the alien ruler watched him with calm expectation. Around them, the soldiers remained perfectly still, their attention fixed on the strange conversation unfolding beside the glowing suit that had belonged to their line of rulers for generations. Daniel let out a slow breath and looked down at the armor again. Machines always told the truth if you listened carefully enough, and this one was already telling him more than most engineers would notice. The stabilization field hummed with steady confidence, the modified relay network carrying power through the new pathway he had built. The armor was no longer fragile the way it had been before, but Daniel could still see places where the system had been designed with too much trust and perfection. He crouched beside the suit again and opened the access panel with calm familiarity, exposing the internal circuitry beneath the polished alloy. The alien soldiers shifted slightly behind their leader, clearly uneasy at the sight of a human mechanic casually opening the command armor of their ruler a second time. Daniel barely noticed them. His focus was already on the machine. "The main relay network was the biggest weakness," he said calmly while his scanner lit up with diagnostic data. "But the motion response system is also too centralized." The alien ruler stepped closer, watching carefully. "Explain." Daniel pointed toward a cluster of crystalline processors embedded within the armor's shoulder assembly. "All movement commands pass through a single translation core before reaching the servos in the limbs. It is precise, but it slows the reaction time if the system ever gets overloaded." The translator repeated his explanation clearly. One of the alien soldiers spoke quietly behind the ruler, their voice carrying disbelief. Daniel's translator struggled with the alien language before delivering the meaning. "Reaction delay is within acceptable limits." Daniel shrugged lightly. Acceptable is not the same thing as optimal. The alien ruler remained silent for a moment, studying the exposed system with thoughtful interest. Daniel reached into his toolkit again and removed a thin fiber connector normally used for shuttle diagnostics. The human component looked almost primitive compared to the alien circuitry surrounding it. That did not bother him in the slightest. Human engineers solved that problem by distributing the workload. Daniel continued while carefully attaching the connector across two control nodes. "Instead of forcing every command through one processor, we give the system more than one path to interpret movement signals." The armor's internal systems reacted instantly to the new connection. Soft lines of turquoise light shifted across the internal circuits as the architecture recalibrated around the additional pathway. Daniel watched the scanner carefully while the machine adjusted. The stabilization field remained perfectly steady. The alien ruler leaned slightly closer, their eyes reflecting the glow of the newly balanced system. "You are teaching the armor to think differently," the translator rendered quietly. Daniel smiled faintly while sealing the connection into place. "Not differently," he said, "just more flexibly." The armor emitted a soft confirmation tone as the recalibration completed. The movement network now displayed two independent interpretation channels instead of one. Daniel closed the access panel again and stood up, brushing a thin layer of sand from his hands. For a moment no one spoke. The alien ruler looked from the repaired armor to the human mechanic standing beside it. The turquoise glow reflected across their eyes as the realization slowly settled in. The armor had not simply been repaired tonight. It had been changed. For several seconds after the recalibration tone faded, no one on the battlefield moved. The restored armor stood between Daniel Carter and the alien ruler like a quiet witness to what had just happened. The turquoise glow flowing through the suit had changed subtly, its rhythm smoother now, more balanced, as if the machine itself understood that its internal logic had been rewritten. Daniel folded his arms loosely and studied the suit with the calm satisfaction of a mechanic who had finished a complicated repair. He did not see anything extraordinary in what he had done. To him, it was simply the natural next step after noticing a design limitation. But the alien soldiers watching the armor were reacting very differently. One of them stepped forward cautiously and activated a diagnostic scanner of their own. A beam of pale light passed across the surface of the command armor, tracing the new internal pathways Daniel had created. The soldier froze halfway through the scan. The translator struggled briefly before delivering the soldier's quiet statement. Reaction latency reduced. Another soldier leaned closer to read the display. Movement interpretation network now distributed. The soldiers exchanged uncertain glances. Daniel recognized the expression immediately. It was the same look technicians everywhere had when they realized a problem they had accepted for years might never have been necessary in the first place. The alien ruler stepped forward again, their attention focused entirely on the armor. The turquoise lines across the suit pulsed calmly as the internal systems continued adjusting to the new architecture. For a moment, the ruler simply rested one hand against the chest plate, feeling the steady hum beneath the alloy. The machine recognized the touch instantly and stabilized its balance around the new control logic. The ruler's eyes moved slowly across the armor's surface, following the faint glow where the human modifications had changed the flow of power. It responds faster. The translator rendered quietly. Daniel nodded. It will also recover faster if a processor gets overloaded. The commands will shift to the second interpretation channel automatically. The alien ruler turned their gaze toward him again. Your people design machines expecting them to break. Daniel shrugged lightly. We design them expecting reality. The answer hung in the air for a moment. The soldiers behind the ruler were now watching Daniel with open curiosity instead of suspicion. One of them spoke quietly to another, their voice carrying a tone of reluctant admiration. The translator could not fully capture the alien phrasing, but the meaning came through clearly enough. The human altered a generational design. The ruler finally lifted the helmet of the restored armor and placed it over their head. The suit sealed with a soft mechanical tone as the command interface recognized its rightful operator. For a brief moment, the turquoise glow brightened across the entire frame as the machine synchronized with the wearer's neural signals. Then the armor moved. The motion was small, only a shift of the ruler's arm, but every soldier present noticed it immediately. The movement was faster than before. Cleaner. The suit responded without the slightest hesitation. The ruler flexed their fingers slowly, studying the response of the servos through the new distributed control system. Then they took a single step forward across the glass sand. The armor adjusted its balance instantly, the stabilization field correcting with smooth precision. Daniel watched with quiet interest. The alien ruler turned back toward him, the helmet visor reflecting the pale light of the moons and the faint turquoise glow of the armor itself. For several seconds they said nothing. Then the translator spoke the ruler's quiet observation. Human Daniel Carter. The voice carried something new now. Not authority alone. Recognition. Your repair did not simply restore the armor. The ruler paused briefly. It improved it. The quiet statement lingered in the desert air, while the turquoise glow of the command armor reflected across the broken battlefield. Daniel Carter shifted his weight slightly, but said nothing at first. Compliments from royalty were not something a salvage mechanic usually knew how to respond to. The alien ruler remained standing in the moonlight, the restored armor adjusting around their movements with smooth confidence. Every small shift of their stance proved the same thing again and again. The machine was faster now, more responsive, more alive. Behind them, the soldiers had begun quietly running their own diagnostic scans again, as if hoping their instruments might prove the change was an illusion. The scanners did not lie. One of the soldiers finally lowered their device and spoke with clear disbelief in their voice. The translator delivered the meaning with careful precision. Reaction time improved by 18%. Another soldier added quietly. Energy distribution efficiency increased. The ruler slowly turned their head toward the soldiers, but did not interrupt them. Instead, they took another step across the glass sand. The armor responded instantly, the stabilization field shifting smoothly with no delay. The motion looked effortless. Daniel watched with the calm focus of someone who had spent years evaluating mechanical performance. That second interpretation channel will keep the system stable under heavier stress, he said casually. If the primary processor gets overloaded, the suit will shift commands automatically instead of freezing for recalibration. The ruler stopped moving and turned their helmet toward him again. The turquoise visor reflected the pale moonlight as the translator rendered the quiet response. Your explanation suggests you expected the armor to face greater demands. Daniel shrugged lightly. Machines built for leaders usually do. For a moment, the ruler simply regarded him in silence. The desert wind moved gently again, stirring thin streams of sand between the scattered wreckage. The battlefield no longer felt tense. Instead, it carried the quiet energy of a moment that none of the soldiers present had expected to witness. The ruler slowly removed the helmet once more. When the seal disengaged, the turquoise glow dimmed slightly, settling back into its steady resting rhythm. Their eyes remained focused on Daniel with thoughtful intensity. Human Daniel Carter. The translator repeated carefully. You approached the armor of my line without permission. Daniel nodded once. That is true. The soldiers behind the ruler shifted slightly at the admission. The ruler continued speaking before any of them could react. You altered its internal architecture. Daniel nodded again. Also true. The ruler paused briefly while the wind brushed across the desert. And you improved it. Daniel gave a small half-smile. I repaired a weakness. The ruler studied him for another long moment. Then something unexpected happened. The ruler turned toward their soldiers and spoke a short command in their native language. The soldiers immediately straightened. One of them hurried back toward the landed transport craft. Daniel frowned slightly, unsure what was about to happen. The ruler turned back toward him and stepped closer until they stood only a few feet away from the human mechanic who had just changed a piece of their people's history. The translator spoke again with calm clarity. In my culture, the ruler said slowly, those who improve the tools of our rulers are not treated as ordinary mechanics. Daniel blinked once, unsure where the statement was going. The ruler's gaze did not waver. They are invited to continue doing so. The desert had grown completely still by the time the alien soldier returned from the transport craft. The faint hum of the command armor continued to drift across the battlefield like a steady mechanical heartbeat, while Daniel Carter stood in the moonlight facing the ruler, whose armor he had quietly rewritten. The soldier approached with careful steps, carrying a small metallic case that reflected the turquoise glow of the armor. When the soldier reached the ruler, they knelt briefly and presented the case with both hands before stepping back again. The ruler accepted it without ceremony and opened the lid. Inside rested a slender data device formed from the same luminous alloy as the armor itself. For a moment, the ruler studied the object before looking back at Daniel. The ruler's eyes reflected the pale moonlight. Not only the armor. The statement hung in the air for several seconds while the soldiers watched the exchange carefully. Daniel glanced down at the repaired suit once more. The turquoise glow had settled into a calm and confident rhythm now, like a machine that had accepted its new identity. He could see the changes he had made reflected in every pulse of energy across the alloy plates. It was still alien technology, but part of it now carried a human idea. He looked back at the ruler and gave a small, thoughtful smile. I am just a mechanic. The ruler tilted their head slightly. So was the one who first forged this armor centuries ago. The response surprised him enough to make him laugh quietly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Daniel slipped the alloy device into his jacket pocket and looked once more across the silent battlefield that had started the entire strange conversation. Finally, he nodded once. The ruler turned toward the waiting transport craft while the soldiers prepared to depart. The command armor moved with smooth precision beside them, its systems humming with the quiet improvements a human mechanic had built under the light of 2 distant moons. And as Daniel Carter followed them toward the transport ship, he realized something unexpected. He had not come to the battlefield looking for history, but somehow, without even trying, he had just changed it.